Well, what I'm concerned about, and I understand your point, Mr. Edwards, but what I'm concerned about and what I think a landlord is concerned about is that, you know, what if I grant this one request and it kind of opens the floodgates, and then I've got everybody just saying, well, I need a pet for emotional comfort too. There's nothing wrong with saying, look, you're going to have to provide me with evidence from a doctor that, in fact, this is something that you need and that you suffer from. That is not unreasonable to do. Question.
What if the doctor says in order to calm the nerves, you smoke 5 cigars a day?
Well, now we're getting into this is an interesting situation. Question was, what happens if you get a letter from the doctor? I haven't seen a letter like this yet. That says that in order to accommodate this person's disability, they're going to smoke 5 cigars a day. Calms his nerves. And you have a no smoking clause. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering, my wife, who's a tobacco lawyer, strongly disagrees with this policy, but you can advertise no smokers. Yeah, can. Remember the protected classes. You can say no smoking. You can say no smoking, absolutely. But getting back to your question, it's an interesting fact scenario. I guess I would argue that you'd have to take that on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I really don't think that would ever come up, and I don't think a doctor would recommend that. The accommodation cases that I've seen normally deal with either a waiver of a no pet for a seeing eye dog, for instance, or for someone who's a schizophrenic. Usually it doesn't come up in that context, though. But let's keep going because question and answers are coming. Okay. Another area, and I'd strongly recommend a couple things. When you get your hands on the regulations and you get your hands on all the law, you may want to go and really thoroughly go through each one of the questions and answers that I've written out here in your landlord guide, because I think it will help you clarify some of these issues. And for those that aren't clarified, and there are going to be some, there's a phone, and you can call the law department, or you can call me, or you can call your own lawyer, and get the answer that way. Here's another issue, though, that is very hot, a very hot issue, and it's this. I want to see what I got here. You guys can see that anyway. Talk about damages in the fair housing context. Occupancy standards. This is a very gray area of the law right now, and it's a gray area of the law for a number of different reasons. And I'm going to help you clarify it for right now, and I'm going to say this with a caveat that it is very important that you affiliate yourself with an organization, as I've stated before, that can keep you updated on the status of this law. Okay? Why? Many times you get claims that will be brought against housing providers for familial status discrimination. And it'll be based on an occupancy policy. Okay? The law, when it was written by Congress, again, we use the word reasonable, and I think it's caused more harm than good. But the law sets forth that as an exemption to the Fair Housing Act, housing providers may set reasonable occupancy standards. And we've been arguing and trying to figure out for many years since then what exactly reasonable occupancy standards are. Now, in 1988, Congress added familial status as a protected class, and we had regulations that were issued as to how to interpret reasonable occupancy standards. Here's where I think, I got to give you some of the history on this so you understand. There was a memo that was drafted and issued by then Frank Keating, who was the general counsel of HUD, in 1991. And what he said was this. He said, as a general rule, and you have to really pay attention, as a general rule, an occupancy restriction of 2 persons per bedroom is reasonable. Now, there are a lot of housing providers and organizations out there who heard that language, and that was the magical language they wanted to hear, and they grasped onto it, they made it their own, but they didn't continue to read the memo. And they didn't read the memo further, and the next line says, that general rule is rebuttable under certain circumstances. And so you need to look to a number of factors to determine whether, in fact, your occupancy policy is reasonable. What are those factors? First of all, when you have a family with children, and let's have a scenario here. 2-bedroom apartment, you have a family of 5, and mom gets pregnant. Okay? So we got 6 people living in a 2-bedroom. Clearly, that's not 2 persons per bedroom, is it? So your policy, I hope, says, as a general rule, 2 persons per bedroom is deemed reasonable. However, there are exceptions to this circumstance, and if you would like to be considered as an exception, you may apply accordingly. It's pretty safe, because the Keating memo, which is what this memo by Frank Keating says, is the following. Keating memo says that not only should you look to that 2-person general rule, but you should also look to see if there are local health and occupancy codes for the municipality where you are living. Okay? So in the city of Shaker Heights, for instance, we have such an ordinance that defines occupancy by square footage. It's very important. The other thing you look to is the size of the bedrooms, the number of the people that are living there, and also the number of the ages of the children is important. Generally speaking, an infant should not be counted under 1 year old. So in my example, what are the things that I'm going to look at? Well, I have 5 people, okay? And then I have a baby, little babies. I have 6 people. I want to know how big the bedroom is, definitely. I want to know the ages of all the children. I'd like to know whether or not my local municipality, where in fact the apartment is located, whether there is a housing occupancy code. And I'm going to take all those things into account and make a decision based on the Keating memo. Now, that's not very helpful to a lot of people. But if you want to be safe, you fall back on square footage. Square footage, though, really upsets a lot of property owners. Why? Because many of the regulations that were passed, and I think Shaker would be included in this, which is it 150 square feet for the first occupant, 100 square feet thereafter?
For the moment, but
right.
ours is under review.
As I was saying, many of these regulations, they weren't passed for the purpose of complying with the Fair Housing Act. They were passed in the event there was a fire to prevent overcrowding in those kind of situations. They're usually found in the health regulations, health and safety regulations of the local ordinance. So there's an argument that they wouldn't apply. But when they do apply, if you look at them, for instance, in Lake County has an occupancy code that applies to all the municipalities, and it's 150 square feet for the first occupant and 100 square feet thereafter, and there's no definition of what a permissible sleeping area would be, in terms of how many people could reside in that sleeping area. And because of that, you can have a 750 square foot apartment and actually have 7 people residing in a 2-bedroom. And that's a real problem. Now, 1991, Frank Keating issues this memo. 1995 comes around, Frank Keating's gone. And there's a new guy in town at HUD, and his name is Nelson Diaz. And Nelson Diaz has got a different idea. He says, you know what we're going to do? Because the housing providers of America, You know, their duty is a sacred one as it is, and we don't have no guidance. There's an outfit called BOCA, not MOCA, BOCA. BOCA is the Building Officials and Code Administrators regulations, and they actually provide regulations that take into account the size of the bedrooms and give habitable floor space for the size of the bedrooms. Now, some of you may have been familiar with these regulations when they came out, July of 1995. And you may say to your tenants or potential tenants, well, we follow the BOCA code. July 1995. You know, the problem is that in September of 1995, those regulations that Nelson Diaz issued that said we should follow BOCA and 2 persons per bedroom, forget about that. The new secretary, her name, and she's still, she's not the secretary, but she's the head of, her title changes so much. Yeah, anyway, what she did is she revoked, Sarah Pratt revoked the regulations and said, until further notice, and this is September 1995, we'll be issuing new regulations soon. But until we do, we're going to pay attention to the Keating memo again. We haven't had any new regulations issued. In preparation for this presentation, I called Sarah Pratt, and I didn't get a return phone call, unfortunately. I even told her I was from the city of Shaker Heights. I thought that might have more leverage. But be that as it may, when you are setting forth what, do you have a policy? You better. What's your policy? What's your policy with regard to occupancy standards? When you have this kind of policy, just take a close look at this, because I just had a case that I was defending a party who took a look at the Keating memo, and they wrote down in their policy 2 persons per bedroom, and then they said, take into account the ages of children, and that was right, and take into account the size of the family, of the bedrooms, and that was right, and take into account the state or the local occupancy code, that was right, and then they said, and also take into account whether or not the children are of the same sex. Well, and they told me that was in the Keating memo. And I looked, and I looked, and I didn't find it in the Keating memo. And so when they told this family that, family, you have to move because we have information that reveals that you have children 8, 5, and 13 that are all in the same bedroom, and one of them is a girl and 2 of them are boys, and that's not acceptable to us. So you're going to have to move. It violates our occupancy policy. They had a problem. And we ended up settling that case because of that, because they didn't have any authority for that. And for those of you that have that policy, whether it be formal or informal, that you will not allow children of opposite sex to reside on one of your properties, I would caution you that you're not in the business of enforcing or promulgating new moral standards. Okay, let's leave that to the ministers and priests and rabbis of our various religious institutions. But for those of you that think that that is in fact your province, I would say watch out, because it is not, and there's no authority for that position under the law. So that's where we are with BOCA and Frank Keating and occupancy standards. And if you're more confused now than you were when I started, I apologize, but that is a very tough area. How am I doing on time? 11:30. I think I've covered most of what I want to talk about substantively. However, I want to talk about one other area before I wrap up and we can have questions and answers. And for those of you that are going to ask questions, it would be really helpful if you walk to the center of the room. There's a microphone, and you could ask your question there. That'd be very helpful. But in any event, some people have told me, well, look, I own 3 or 4 properties. I'm doing the best I can here. I work a full-time job. I've gone to fair housing seminars. I've seen you twice, Bill. I really enjoy it, but I'm doing the best I can. And what the problem was with this last incident was that the employee that I had was part-time, not really interested in what was going on. And even though I had trained him, he did what he did, and he went out on his own. I can't help that, and I should not be liable for that. Let me remind you of something. The duty to obey this law is non-delegable. As long as your employee is acting within the scope of their employment and they harm someone, whether you know it or not, you are on the hook as the owner of that apartment or the owner of that house. And that can extend to the very absurd where, for instance, the trustees of a trust that owns a house that's located 10 states away actually were liable for the acts of a part-time frontline leasing agent, even though they had never even met the person. So keep that in mind. But what's the solution? I mean, we've been talking about problems. Some people would say the solution is to get out of the business, and I don't agree. But because I think it's a great business to be in. We've talked about the modification versus accommodation. Sure. Question comes up. Should I monitor the performance of my employees? Should I self-test? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Should I hire fair housing organizations to test me? One thing that I would caution you about, a caveat, what do I mean by self-test, for those of you that may not know, is this. Should I have someone who has no intention of renting the apartment be hired for a fee to apply for one of my apartments, and that someone would be an African American, for instance, and then 15 minutes later, I'd have a similarly situated individual, also paid for a fee, who would be a white applicant, show up, and we'd all compare notes, and they'd fill out a chart, a detailed chart as to how they were treated. And then we'd write 2 columns, one with a B and one with a W. And we'd compare, well, how long did you have to wait? Were you told about a credit check? Were you told about a security deposit? What were you told about the lease requirements? What about the rental requirements? What were you told was available? What was not available? Were you given the agent's card? Were you given a guest card to sign? We compare and contrast all these different factors. And it really does show who's organized and who isn't, more than anything else. And who's paying careful attention to detail and who isn't. The advantage of self-testing is that you actually have a situation where you can monitor how your business is being run. My only concern to you is if you're going to do self-testing, you better be prepared to follow up on situations where someone isn't enforcing your policies. Why? The reason is, if you're going to practice fair housing, you can't just talk the talk. You got to walk the walk, too. And if you're going to practice fair housing, you're going to have to follow through with the testing, because if you ever get sued in any capacity, those testing reports are what we call, in the legal business, discoverable. What does that mean? That means that when Avery Friedman comes knocking on your door and says, I want to know what the results were of the tests that you conducted in 1995, and your lawyer argues those are protected by attorney-client privilege because B.Edwards supervised the testing, Avery Friedman's going to win. And he's going to be able to get his hands on those test reports, and he's going to be able to say then to the members of the jury, you see what we have here is not only one isolated instance of discrimination, we have a pattern and practice. No, indeed, we have a policy of unlawful discrimination, of tolerance towards abuse. This employee had 4 shops where he clearly treated African Americans worse than white Americans, and as a result, you should fine for the plaintiff in this matter. Be careful of that. If you believe in fair housing, I think it's a great idea. But for those of you that aren't totally convinced, fine. For those of you that have employees, I think you should encourage people to work within your system. And you should try to do that in a number of different ways. First of all, by having the system, it emphasizes objective criteria. I don't have time to tell you everything you should have in that objective criteria. But clearly, you should have such things as income, prior rental history, credit history, whether someone's been subject to an eviction before. That's all very important. I could go on and on, but all of those are non-discriminatory reasons, non-discriminatory inquiries that apply to everyone and need to apply to everyone. Esprit de corps. When you have a business that you're running, and for those of you who aren't, supervising employees, this may not be as big an issue. But for those of you that have a company, that are running a business, you want people to really work, not because it's a job. You want them to work because they love it, because they look forward to going to work, because they're part of a team, that they're part of something bigger than just themselves. And if you encourage positive performance within the system, whether it be in the form of bonuses or whatever, or recognition, that kind of esprit de corps starts to come to the forefront. It can be very important. It's also a great teaching tool. You can teach people that there are differences between knowing kind of what the policy is and actually practicing the policy. Knowing kind of, well, yeah, I tell them that our occupancy policy is 2 persons per bedroom, when that's really not the policy. And the policy is, as a general rule, our policy is 2 persons per bedroom, although there are exceptions, and if you'd like to be considered for one of those exceptions, maybe you need to fill out this application. Okay? It's a difference between kind of being familiar with and knowing, mastering, and practicing. And in addition, I would recommend for those of you that are really serious about being successful in this business, either attending or participating in quarterly fair housing seminars. Once a year is not enough. We'd all like to think it is, but I have a hard time believing that anybody's going to be practicing fundamentals they're going to turn into effective habits by showing up for 3 hours on a Saturday morning on April 18th. I just don't believe it. So that's something you have to consider. Ultimately, what you want to do is you want to promote self-awareness within that system. And there's a couple reasons for that. You want to be able to show your employees that this is not only something we are kind of announcing, but what we really believe in, and that there are consequences for not complying. It's kind of a carrot and stick approach, but I think it could be very effective. Ultimately, though, you should always return to the fundamentals, which are, in this case, that, stated quite simply, we want to treat everybody the same, we want to emphasize team goals, and we want to be able to do it in a way where you don't have to think about it every 5 minutes. But if you don't get these systems in place now, practically speaking, you're not going to be as successful as you could be. And that's something that really, I think, matters for all of us, because while we all are in the business of providing housing, we're also in the business of, of running a business. And, I used to be a football coach, and I always thought that the best coaches were the best organized coaches. And that the head coaches coach the coaches. And that the chief operating officers coaches the managers. And it goes downward from there. So for those of you who are running 2-bedroom, 1 single-family homes, I still think these principles apply. And I still think that you need to take them into account, because if you don't, unfortunately, you might be a respondent or a defendant. So I'm sure there are questions and answers. I'm losing my voice, but I will do my best to entertain any that you might have. So with that, I'll open the floor up to questions and answers. The mic is located in the middle of the room.
I'd like to know if this is discriminatory. You have an up and down house, and the upstairs tenant you leased with the no pet policy. The new potential tenant has 2 cats, and although you do not want the cats, they are good long-term potential tenants. So is it discriminatory against the people upstairs to rent the downstairs with the cats?
Let me make sure I understand something. You have a no pet policy, is that correct? And yes?
Yes.
Okay, and what you're saying is you're going to waive the no pet policy to these potential tenants who are moving in because they could be long-term tenants, correct? Okay. This is where, okay, it's a good question.
And I wanted to know about when you talked about the deposit, that type of thing.
Security deposit?
Yeah.
Okay.
What you do with those.
Everybody hear the question? All right. This is the kind of situation where I think you're inviting trouble. You have, for those of you, let me just clarify what the facts were here. We have a up and down house, is that correct? And in that house, we have already tenants who reside in the upstairs portion of the property. There is a no pet provision in the lease that would apply equally to any tenant who resides on the property. And in this situation, we have someone who potentially could really be a long-term tenant, but they have cats, and and if we waive the no pet policy, they move in, your place is occupied, you don't have to worry about getting a new tenant, right? When you have a policy, you want to make sure that it's equally enforced, because when you start to make exceptions and carve out little niches, I think you're inviting a problem. The example could be one in which, right now, I don't know what the race, for instance, of your tenants is. Is there a difference in the race of your tenants?
The upstairs, the African American.
Okay, in this case, I think clearly to allow the no pet provision to only apply to the African American tenants would create what we're calling a very disparate treatment that I've been describing. And I think in that situation, although you're tempted at getting that place rented, yet that no pet provision either has to be completely waived for everyone, which is an option, or it has to be completely enforced for everyone. Because remember, this isn't a situation where someone's disabled. This is something where you have an obligation under the law, and unfortunately, I think you might have a real problem in that instance.
Is that if you own other units elsewhere, is it make it a policy you can't be a policy of your company, or is it be a policy of that one rental unit?
Okay, question was, when you make a modification of a policy, should the modification of the policy be for can it be for just one unit, or should it be a company-wide policy? Always, I recommend a company-wide policy where you get into real problems, and where there have been problems in the past is where certain rules and regulations, remember that 3604B rules? They only apply to a certain set of buildings as opposed to others, and there can be an allegation in there somewhere kind of laced and intertwined that you're actually steering certain rules and regulations towards one group as opposed to another. And you can get really nailed on that. I mean, that'd be something I'd be very cognizant of. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a rentable third, and I'm considering, depending on the answer to the question, I'm considering, because of a limitation of parking, creating a policy for the third floor only that would include no vehicles on the premises, which would include the first floor having 2, the second floor having 2, and the third none. Would I be running into a problem with that? I mean, at the time, my current third floor tenant does not have a vehicle. What I'd like to do is introduce this during the next term of lease. Now, an additional item is that she's African American, so it might be construed as an effort to steer or do anything like that. But that's not my intention. I would just like to minimize the vehicle parking.
Remember what I said earlier, that, we want to begin with the end in mind. And, one of the questions that I always ask myself is, I'm not sure, I want to ask myself how this would appear to 8 disinterested, objective people, or 12, depending on what court you're in. In this case, it seems to me that while, again, you've got a short-term fix, but you have, when you implement policies, you have to think beyond the immediate. How is this going to impact on my organization later on? You know, what happens down the line if I have an individual who is disabled?
Why would they
who applies?
if they're disabled, though?
Well, maybe they're disabled in another way other than physically. Maybe they, perhaps they have a car though. Okay, I guess, I'd seriously consider whether or not I would want to implement that. I mean, without it giving you legal advice. I mean, I'd re-examine your policy. Next question.
There's something you said that troubles me greatly, because I realize it's a law, of course, but I wonder, you said that the only criteria for renting an apartment or house should be the ability to pay the rent, but it's kind of a two-edged sword, where the government tells you in effect that the landlord is responsible for the conduct of the tenant, particularly in case of drugs and stuff like that. And if you're not allowed to screen them or things like that, you are kind of in a bind. So I wonder, are there any measures that the owners can take to select or screen people to ensure that they're either similar to or in harmony with the present tenants or the owners? In other words, can you include class or type or lifestyle in your evaluation or selection criteria of a potential renter?
Okay. Short answer to that is no. The long answer
The law
is,
says no, I know, but
the long answer is, hold on, I'll explain. I mean, I understand the concern.
right.
Especially if you have property that is located in an area that, is maybe on the borderline of a high crime area, or maybe it's located in a high crime area. You really are facing a two-edged sword. First of all, when you have, under the Ohio landlord-tenant law, if you have actual knowledge of a tenant engaging in drug activity, it's not an option. You have a duty to evict them, and you have to bring that clearly.
I'm speaking of applicants, though.
Okay, now applicants themselves, this kind of opens up another wonderful Pandora's box. There's a case, and this was a question that was asked: can current illegal drug users, can they be excluded from one's apartment? And how do we find out if someone's a current illegal drug user? Well, can we give them a drug test? Can we say, here's your application, and here's your urine cup? There's actually, 2 years ago, maybe 3, I've been doing this a little too long. What's the name of the property? Yeah, it was in Euclid. There was a property, they're headquartered at somewhere outside of Ohio, but that's exactly what they did. And they said that, we're going to give drug tests to everybody who applies because we've had drug problems, and we want the right kind of people living in our tenant. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Anytime you use that kind of language, I cringe. The right class. Now, I know what you mean, but here's the difficulty. While current illegal drug users are not protected by the Fair Housing Act, persons who are formerly addicted and are recovering are protected. So, example, Joe Blow, who was a coke addict for many years, is just recovering and goes into a house. He is now in this halfway house. He finally comes out. He's clean, but he's still got the drugs in his system. So he shows up, and he pees in the cup, and he flunks, and you deny him. There's a case called U.S. versus Southern Management says that he has a cause of action against you.
Actually, I guess I may have a complicated issue by just mentioning drugs, but I happen to remember, how Cleveland will board up your property and stuff if they find some case. But basically, mine is a more general concern for the city itself and for the deterioration of neighborhoods. And I wondered if there are any studies that have been made to show that the strict application of the fair housing law causes many people to, for example, move, like when their lease is up and so forth. If people move into their apartment, for example, or in their neighborhood who are of not of their type, who they feel is not of their type or class or style or whatever, such that they don't want to live around, so they move. And I've watched a couple of cities around here where this has occurred, and I just wondered, have studies been made to...
Well, I'll tell you the one study that I'm very familiar with. And it was a study that was conducted by the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1992. And they actually surveyed 7 states. And in that survey that they conducted, what they found was that a black applicant, whether it be for a loan or for a house or for an apartment, was 6 times more likely to be turned away than a white applicant.
Yeah, I realize that.
Now, in terms of class, do you want to say something? Yeah. Would you like to jump in? I mean, let me finish my... In terms of a class issue, I think what you have to really focus on is this. One of the things that Shaker, I think, is an inner ring suburb, Cleveland Heights is an inner ring suburb, Lakewood, we all face, is the fear that our communities will be overrun by persons who will not keep their property up. I submit to you that it is a fear, and it's all but just that. And what we have to focus on instead is renting to the individuals who, in fact, can pay for their units, who have proper credit, who have not had a previous history of eviction. And that, in fact, if you go through that non-discriminatory objective criteria, sir, you'll find that your concerns will be seriously alleviated because you'll actually be renting to the very individuals that you're describing.
I was just going to address your question from the city standpoint. For those of you that do work with our Pro-Integrative Services Department, and those of you that don't but would like to, and I would encourage you all to do so, one of the things that they found within the past 4 years is that they have been as busy, if not more busy, than they were in the late 1980s. And the reason for that is we are having more and more property owners that do start to list their properties with us. And for those of you that work with Judy Steeler, who does a wonderful job at making sure that landlords, one of the reasons she works with you is what we're trying to do is making sure the landlords understand that by keeping their property in good shape on the outside and on the inside. Now, those of you that work with Judy, she's probably made some little suggestions to you. Well, you may want to do this on the inside. You may want to paint here. You may want to fix the cracks in this wall. The reason why she's doing that is by maintaining those property standards, then you're going to be able to maintain a reasonable rent for your place. And if you have reasonable objective criteria that you're using to decide whether or not an applicant meets all of your criteria, then if you, let's say that based on the value of your property, you can rent your unit for $800. And Judy's good. She'll tell you what she thinks you can rent your apartment or your home for. If you have objective criteria that you can base that on, that in and of itself is probably going to screen out a lot of problems for you. Okay? And that's why I would encourage those of you that do have properties in Shaker to work with our Pro-Integrative Services Housing Department because they do a great job in that area. And they have been busy. In fact, Judy's sitting back there and she's nodding her head. Yes, we're very busy. But there's a reason why. We're doing that so that we can hopefully, by making objective criteria and making the homes more appealable for people who relocate from all over the place. We get a lot of residents that come in who work in the hospitals that look in Shaker. The new corporations that come in, they work with a relocation agent here in Shaker Heights to help them find suitable properties. And so by keeping your property in a great condition, we then can help you objectively make sure that you've got a good match for your property.
That was the city's official comment.
Getting back
Now,
to the
good
question of pets, even though you reopen it and let pets come into your home, if the occupant is not going to do the right thing, like you have carpeting all over the place, they do not take care of this, and when they move out, you have to replace your carpeting all over. Now, how is the landlord reimbursed by that?
Well, that's really more of a landlord-tenant question, but I can address that for you. There's nothing wrong with requiring what's called a pet deposit when someone moves into the property. Just be sure that you understand that as the way a security deposit is defined under the Ohio landlord-tenant law, a pet deposit is also a security deposit. So if it's a double security deposit, for instance, then in fact you have to take into all the factors that you would normally take into account when that individual would be moving out, whether in fact the damage was done beyond reasonable wear and tear, but also if that person resides on the property for more than 6 months, then you have to pay interest on the difference between what the first month's rent would be and the excess security deposit. And I think the rates, I think it's 5% or 10%, I can't remember. But that's, if you want to know what the section of the law is, ma'am, that's 5321.16 of the Ohio Revised Code. I'm sorry, ma'am?
You say that the interest rate is 5 or 10%, so the bank won't give you that if you put it in a separate account, and then you're taking out of your own pocket?
Well, I didn't write the law. I'm just telling you what it is. Yes, sir.
I have a follow-up question to the question that the gentleman had earlier, and it's something where I have direct experience with. A woman who happens to be my mother lived in an apartment building for 31 years in Euclid, and she loved it. I was trying to get her out of there. She just loved the place and loved living there, and it's, you know, when you get to a certain age, you don't want to move. Tenants moved in below her who were extremely unruly. You know, their life began around 9 o'clock in the evening and would usually culminate around 4 a.m. After numerous complaints to the management, calling the police, her car was vandalized, she ultimately had to move. Is there any protection under the law? I'm a landlord.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I'm thinking, how do I, and if I know that a potential tenant, no matter what race they are, no matter what abilities or disabilities they may have, is going to be unruly and does not know how to abide by just normal social standards of behavior, what protection do I have as a landlord?
Well, what I would always recommend, I mean, to any property owner who has a lease, and I assume that there was a lease with both tenants, was there? Yes. Okay. Even if there is not a lease, the landlord-tenant law is clear that a tenant has a duty to respect and maintain the quiet enjoyment of others around him or her. And in that instance, you would have had, if you had a provision in your lease, a quiet enjoyment provision, you could have in fact placed that person on notice to correct the situation, and if they continued, you could have brought an action against them for breach of the lease and an eviction action, where you could have actually ousted them from the property. That may not make you happy because that costs money and time, and I understand that. But that happens sometimes in these situations, and I'm sure that as you experienced it, you know, I wish that I would have talked to you beforehand, because Euclid's a favorable property owner court right now, and you know, that you probably would have been successful, you know, given the facts that you've described to me. Any other questions? Right. Next question.
Simple question. You have two applicants. Both of them seem to meet your qualifications, but the other applicant, who is not a member of the protected class, is someone who maybe has more income and is attractive to you for that reason. You think they'll pay a better on time and so on, things like this. And it'd be nice to have somebody that has a lot of money to, you know, so you won't have as many problems. Are you forced to go with the regulated class then, or?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think what you need to do, though, is you need to ask yourself, what's my criteria in terms of when I have two people come in the door? Do I take first come, first serve? I would. I mean, if applicant A came to me, submitted his or her application, whether they're black, white, or purple, and they qualify, then in fact, that's the person you're going to rent to, as opposed to someone who's
Can-
then
can-
later in the day comes in.
Can you have a policy of talking to several applicants, at least maybe 3 or 4 before you pick one, or is
I
that?
think it's dangerous to do that because you open up a real problem area. I mean, because what you want to do is, again, you want to establish an objective criteria that allows you to make these decisions like this.
Yeah.
What you're doing by saying, can I have a policy where I have 3 or 4 people and I can kind of talk to them and kind of pick, you're really inviting problems. Believe me. I mean, even though you may want the person
The best qualified
who's,
person,
well, both
yeah.
were qualified, you said, but you said one of them was more preferred.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
I think that's where you really get into, well, what does that mean? How is that objective? I mean, other than the fact that the guy makes more money.
Okay, can you
You can have an income requirement.
Can you
Six
have
times your, okay, go ahead.
right? Can you have economic discrimination?
The Fair Housing Act does not prohibit economic discrimination.
Okay.
So therefore, if you have a policy, for instance, that requires a tenant to make 6 times in their income, an annual income, 6 times what would be 1 month's rent, or the annual rent, I should say, then
That-
you know that's non-discriminatory. But then again, the problem is you have is, can I lease the unit?
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? You take this.
I was just wondering if you had like 3 or 4 applications that you should be able to decide if you can tell the person that you're reviewing other applications. Are you allowed to tell them that? I mean, if someone called on a Monday and you're not going to review the applications till Friday, later that week, are you allowed, to tell them that you're reviewing applications and you call them if,
I mean, here's a suggestion. When you get an application, well, first of all, whenever you receive an application, the property should go off the market, okay? Number one. Because you need to process that application. Because if that person applied first and they qualified, then in fact, they should get the apartment, period. Now, what you can have is a waiting list that indicates, to other individuals, look, this is currently off the market, but we have a waiting list if you'd like to sign, and then you can notify that individual that you'll process it. Different companies do it different ways. But again, I think we have the same kind of problem. Well, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think about who's going to be qualified. You may want to, again, you have to have, I would recommend, a set policy that you can quote verbatim of how you're going to process any application. How you go about it is something you're going to have to determine, though, sir.
Okay.
And I think you'd have to do that, with advice.
That's a tough one there.
Okay.
One more question then.
Sure.
Are you allowed, I was told that you're not allowed to ask for a credit check, or to check applicant's credit. Are you
Oh, no,
actually-
you can ask for a credit check.
You can get a credit check?
Absolutely, and I'd recommend that.
And you can find out whether or not the person been evicted. You can do also.
You can ask the
with other-
question, and you can access that information on your own if it's in the city of Cleveland. They've got records that they keep.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
Back a while ago when you was talking about the pets, now if you already have tenants in your home and later on they decide to get a pet and then you don't want the pet there, how could you go back making them get rid of the pet?
Okay, now do you have a lease with these tenants?
Yeah,
All right, and does your lease say no pets?
yeah,
Okay, and you're saying to me that you had a tenant
yeah, for a long
a
time.
long time, and then they got a pet, right?
And then they turn around and get a pet.
Okay, well, they're in violation of their lease, correct?
Yeah,
Okay, well, that means that you can actually enforce that provision of the lease, which would outlaw pets, if there's no fair housing circumstances around it. But that's really up to you to bring forward, sir. You need to put them on notice that they need to get rid of the pet, or else you'll have to, bring an action against them for breach of the rental agreement,
okay.
okay?
No, thank you.
Okay.
What I'm going to do, because I want to try and hold to this schedule, is Bill and I will both be around afterwards to answer some questions if you have additional questions. But those of you, I promised I'd get out of here at 12. I want to get you out at 12, or 5 after. Two things before you leave. For those of us that are landlords with our pro-integrative services policy, on the back table, you will see the acknowledgement form that we will ask you to sign to agree to work within our pro-integrative program. And part of that new acknowledgement form is that you've gone through fair housing training and that you understand the fair housing laws. So now that you've come through here, you can sign this form. So I'd ask you, if you'd please, to pick one up on the back table on your way out and make sure you fill it out if you'd like to work with our pro-integrative services department. And Judy Steeler is in the back if you have any questions. Additionally, hopefully each of you have been passed out a mug, and those of you that haven't, we have them on the back table. This is just kind of a thank you to you for taking your time out this morning for something that we feel is very important in the city of Shaker Heights. You also will be able to pick up a certificate of completion for this program. Mary Murphy has a certificate, so if you could see her on your way out. And that way, in case you do find yourself on the other side of a fair housing complaint, you can put out this certificate and show them that at least you've had 3 hours of training. All right? Thank you once again for your time and your questions, and have a good day.